I'm A-dae Romero-Briones, and I am Kiowa and Cochiti Pueblo from New Mexico. I run the Native American Food and Agricultural Program at First Nations Development Institute. And my formal training is as a food and agriculture attorney. And yeah, so most of my colleagues are run at the Native American Agriculture Fund. Janie Hip was my mentor. Went to the University of Arkansas Food and Law program, and very honored to be here today. So I think I was supposed to open up with a short presentation, not only about our work, but like the role of women in agriculture. And so when Kent posed that question to me, I was like, do I approach this from the Kiowa perspective or the Cochiti perspective? Because it's very different, of course. And we're talking about corn, so I'm going to go with the Pueblo perspective, right? And one of the most important, and I'm a lawyer, so like if I get to like legal speak, please just stop me and say like you're going down the rabbit hole. But really, when we think about like Indigenous food, and we think about Indigenous community, and we think about Indigenous women, like that is the eye of the hurricane or the eye of the tornado, because when we think about this country and we think about agriculture and its reliance on actually private property rights, that is almost the antithesis to Indigenous organization, political institutions, social institutions, and legal institutions, because women, predominantly owned the land and owned the seeds in Pueblo culture. But when Spanish and Americans arrived, that switched, right? They now, like, men were in leadership roles, women had the seeds, but now like there was this altered relationship between women, seeds, and land. And so I think a lot of food sovereignty in America has to do with challenging the roles and the legal structures around property ownership and the predominance of men in agriculture. And if you ask my grandma in Cochiti, she'll be like, okay, yeah, like everybody's talking about the destruction of agriculture and like the over harvesting, the over processing. There's a lot of things. You can just type in agriculture and all these like negative things come up. And my grandma would say, that's because, women aren't involved anymore. That was my grandma's take on it. And, to some extent, that's true. We see the American agriculture system, and it's dominated by men. It's dominated by a certain race of men, and anything outside of that structure, like, is challenged. And so, when we're talking about food sovereignty, we're really talking about both historical narratives about what agriculture means, the resulting legal structures that support that narrative, and the traditional roles that helped us maintain Indigenous cycles of growth, not only with our corn, but which was like the key and the indicators for how Indigenous cultures were then structured around those food systems. So it's like when they said, okay, talk about the role of women, I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a heavy topic, because you can go down any one of those conversations to really delve into like, what does it mean to be an Indigenous woman in agriculture? So I chose the legal field. My grandparents are both farmers and in Cochiti, and so we do have age-old seeds that my grandma does protect. And the most interesting thing, and Kent was so kind to send me like Kiowa seeds, and he has stories around that. But when we think about how agriculture, and you think of seeds, like, it is now, like, seeds are commodified now, right? Like, there's seed patents, there's ways that seed companies have made profits off of seeds. But when you think about my grandma, who has all her seeds in a little coffee can in the back of her pantry, it's a very different legal structure, and the way you protect those seeds is very different, right? One is dependent largely on the community and the family relationships to protect those seeds, and another is trying to kind of get into that, to disrupt that relationship and those protective systems. So that means protect that it has to disrupt social relationships in that community in order to get access to those seeds. And on the other hand, you have intellectual property rights that are so slighted towards seed companies. Like it is a very tedious world to get into intellectual property and seed patenting, because it does favor larger companies and the ability to actually maneuver that system. And we can get all into that if that is of an interest. And so talking about seeds, talking about women, and now let's talk a little bit about property rights. One of the major, so regenerative agriculture is the thing now, right? Everybody uses that term. Regenerative agriculture, we need like carbon sinks, and we need to like, what do they call it? They say we need to sequester carbon. That's the terminology. And it should be known, like when we talk about agriculture, the different camps have different nomenclature. And so regenerative agriculture is probably the newest kid on the block, but we have had like movements around organic agriculture. We've had movements around sustainable agriculture. We have agroecology. We have permaculture. Now we have regenerative agriculture, and each one of these systems kind of maintain its own nomenclature and uses its own terminology. So regenerative agriculture really focuses on carbon sequestration and counting carbon and I'm just paraphrasing, so you can find your own like really official definitions. But when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, they're really trying to remediate like agricultural processes and production that have like devoided the soil of important nutrients like carbon. But it's frustrating to Indigenous people, right? Because like, okay, how do you know if your soil has carbon? Or how do you count carbon, right? Like it's sort of following a trajectory like nutrition, the nutrition field kind of followed is like, okay, in order to have a healthy diet, you need vitamin B and you need iron and you need vitamin D. But like nobody knows if a food has vitamin D unless you have like the nutrition label. And so the same way with regenerative agriculture, like we don't know if like this plant has more carbon because somebody needs to count those carbons. And I don't know, like we have engineers in the group. So I'm sure like this makes much more sense to you because maybe you know how to count carbon, but the average person does not know how to count carbon. Or so we really rely on like experts in this field to do that counting for us. And it sort of takes out the power of a community to actually create the systems it needs to not only serve the community, but serve their environment and, to create processes that balance out the two. And so, and I'm not knocking any one of these systems. I'm just saying like these types of systems rarely have like people in them. It's all about like the science, and it's all about something external to the people. And I think that's the major difference when we talk about Indigenous food systems, women and our seeds, is like the whole point is that Indigenous people, Indigenous community, and Indigenous seed keepers need to be empowered to actually make the decisions about their lands and their foods and their communities. And that really starts with like empowering women. Like we have to teach our kids, even before they can speak, that we have to be able to make these decisions, because the moment we place a child in the school system, somebody else has the knowledge, somebody else has the right words, somebody else that is imparting something to you because you don't have it, you're learning, right? And so really the empowerment of women and the empowerment will allow us to empower the children who are in these communities, that will allow us to challenge all these systems that are really trying to replace Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous food systems and Indigenous knowledge bases.
Well, thank everybody for coming. We're gonna wrap up here. There's so much information, so much to just sit and think about, and even, us here, students, coming up, it really kind of allows us to think about our next steps. How are we gonna help our communities and bring some of this back, our old ways, and even, these new technologies and these big companies, and where we fit in this world, So thank everybody for sharing, and have a good week. You spoke about empowering Indigenous women, and what can a place maybe like the center, we're inside of a agriculturally heavy school in Oklahoma, which is very has a high population of Native people. How can a place like this, maybe bridge the gap between these companies who aren't people involved and community involved in Indigenous women, who a lot of times are the seed bearers, like you said?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because so when I went to the University of Arkansas, it's a it's a ag school, right? And one of the, and this is something Kent touched on. Oh, it was hard. One, because the school wants the seeds. Like, there are scientists who would die to have a corn seed that is perennial, right? Like in my community, we have perennial corn seeds, not annuals. So like every year they come up if we plant them correctly at the right time. And any seed scientist would love that seed. And so we had to be really, really careful with the kinds of information we shared. But one of, I think, the most successful way I saw, like the integration of the two communities, was there are like, if you ACES, I'm sure some of you know who ACES is, but like there are so many Indigenous scientists that are looking, and it's, you guys are all in the ag school, you know how hard it is to get like research dollars and publishing and like all the stuff you need to be like a legit academic professional. It really takes a lot, and it takes a lot of competition, it takes a lot of resources. And so if there was like a way to structure support of Indigenous scientists in the ag field or even in the engineering field, solely like focused on them, I think that would go a long way, and perhaps answers would come there. But also, and this is kind of like non-traditional, if there was a way for food and agriculture colleges to actually support language revitalization programs in communities, there is amazing things that happen when you learn about Indigenous languages and worldviews, and how those concepts influence how we grow food. Um, and it allows like more Indigenous children to be brought up in these systems that support Indigenous food systems, as opposed to maybe going to the early childhood center in town where they're totally, you're given USDA free lunch meals that come from surplus agricultural products, which is like fine, but like you can get that anywhere. In Oklahoma, you have tribes all around who are trying to do language revitalization. And Kent, like one of the reasons Kent and I connected was around language and seeds. And I think there's an opportunity that is just being missed by like agricultural colleges not supporting or not knowing to support some of these language programs happening in these communities. So First Nations is a philanthropic organization. So we deal with like money transactions and institutions across the board on any given day. Like my program has given out $9 million to 362 tribally based food and agriculture projects. So Miko, we used to be the largest supporter of food sovereignty projects. Now we're second to NAF. But I gladly give that title to Janie Hipp. She deserves it. But all that I'm saying is like, so I bring all of that up to say that agriculture right now is in a really, like it's in a state of change, right? People are questioning the production practices, they're questioning the industry, they're questioning the makeup of the industry. And so funders and even the federal government, you know, we're having a transition right now. Who knows how that's gonna go? But like all of these changes are making people question agriculture. And so based on my interactions with people who fund agriculture and fund projects and are major donors to universities who focus on agriculture, they always want the new thing. They always want something better. They always want to see change. They want to see impact, whatever that means. And so I think like you all as a university are in a great position to offer something other than what people are used to. And if that is so, and we just made a movie called Gather. I don't know if anybody has seen it, but it's a documentary and it's about Indigenous food systems. And we've had so many inquiries about Indigenous food systems from major agricultural companies, major universities, because there's a hunger right now in the field about how to incorporate Indigenous people into mainstream agriculture. And I would say if there was like a university that was agriculture focused, that was trying to do that like formally, I think there would be a lot of financial support coming from many different places for that kind of concept.
What like role of technology do you think could be coming into like the agriculture system, and what different roles do you think technology could play in kind of bringing about the I guess the cultivation of these like programs and putting more students into, you know, being involved with them?
Sean, that is like the question of the decade. What role does technology have in agriculture? Because it's a heavy concept. Like, okay, first we have to define technology. You know what? My Kiowa uncle says, you know, Kiowa ways are so old, they're new. So some of the things that they practiced like thousands of years ago, particularly around fire, around seed saving, like are now considered new technologies, which is kind of weird. But like, if we think about agriculture in the development of society, yes. So we think about, right now we're considered in the fourth cycle of agricultural revolution. So the first one is like the moment agriculture started, and then the second one is like, I think it was like industrialization. The third one is, anyways, we're in the fourth one. I'm on the spot, so I can't think of them. So we're in the fourth cycle, and right now we see competition from like the organic community, the sustainable community, now the regenerative ag community for like, what are we gonna call this cycle? But we also have the role of technology. Like there's like nanotechnology that's trying to influence how we grow food. Like if there's more precision involved, when we look at like actually computer parts, or if we look at the technology of Indigenous people. So I don't think there's like an industry consensus on what technology means. Because, and I'll just tell you a really short story, 30 seconds. So before I started at First Nation, I worked for a billionaire, and we lived on the island. He owned the island in Hawaii, and his idea was he wanted to create an oasis. He was a tech engineer, and so he wanted to implement technology into food. And I was like, oh, okay, well, you know, I'm an agriculture attorney. I can figure this out. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to implement CRISPR on this island, which is he wanted to make it a place where wealthy people could come and they eat the food and they like, it's the fountain of youth. Like it cures their ailments. And he was designing food from seeds that would adjust to whatever ailment these folks had. And, you know, I came from a little reservation. I grew up like half time in Hall Creek, half time in Cochiti. These things were nowhere in my like vision of the world. And so when he implemented it, oh my gosh, like it was havoc. It created havoc not only on the environment, it created havoc in the community because there's discrepancies between health and like how much like the hotels on that island now cost $2,000 a room. I mean, so like there's definitely parts of the world that are moving towards like a technology that we've never seen before. That scares the heck out of me. I don't, and I wanted to stop, but that's just like my opinion. My opinion is not going to stop that field. I think the big question is not what the role of technology is going to have on agriculture. It's the role of people in limiting technology in agriculture. And so I think that is a question for students like your age, because you understand technology in ways that my generation doesn't. And so you are going to be posed with ethical questions about how far we take this. That's not it. That's not an easy question. And so like, that's my long-winded answer of like, oh my gosh, that is like a great question that just has no answers. And I'll end that question is like, one of the most important Indigenous tenets in almost across the board is this idea of time. But that is part of the agricultural equation that is often tried to limit. Like we try to limit time, like we need yield within a season. We need like production and efficiency means less time. But in an Indigenous food system, like we hear things like 7 generations, it takes 7 generations to really have like a strong plant and seed. We like talk about elders, like this concept of time is very different in food systems, and it influences how we view technology.